John Miller had always been a man of quiet routines. Every morning he would wake before the sun, step outside his small ranch house and breathe in the crisp desert air. The smell of dust, sagebrush, and freshly churned soil was comforting to him. He had spent most of his life tending to his cattle, mending fences, and keeping the land in order. His ranch was modest but steady, a place where life moved slowly and predictably. John liked it that way. The quiet rhythm of ranch life gave him peace, but every now and then he longed for a touch of adventure, something to break the monotony of endless work and solitude. One late autumn morning, John was sitting at his worn wooden table with a cup of black coffee, scrolling through an old online property auction site. He often did this for fun, imagining what it would be like to own some forgotten piece of land, a small cabin, or an abandoned farmhouse. It was a game, a way to pass time and dream about possibilities that were far from his usual ranch life. On this particular day, something unusual caught his eye. It was a tiny cabin listed for the unbelievable price of 12 cents. 12 cents! John rubbed his eyes, thinking he must have misread it. But no, the listing clearly stated the cost. The idea seemed absurd, almost comical. Who could sell anything for less than a dime? The description was brief and mysterious. The cabin was old and abandoned, located in a remote part of Arizona, far from any town or road. It had been forgotten for decades, left to the desert elements, and yet somehow it still stood. The pictures were grainy and dark, showing a weathered wooden structure with a sagging roof and wild shrubs growing around it. Most people would have scrolled past it, dismissing it as worthless. But John felt a spark of curiosity. Something about it called to him. Perhaps it was the thrill of owning something so unusual, or the simple idea that such a small, forgotten place could belong entirely to him. He leaned back in his chair, taking another sip of coffee, and thought about the possibilities. He could use it as a storage shed for ranch tools, a hunting lodge for the cooler months, or even a quiet retreat where he could escape the endless chores of ranch life. The thought of exploring it, of stepping inside a place that had been untouched for so long, filled him with a strange excitement. Without much hesitation, John clicked the Buy Now button. Just like that, for 12 cents, the cabin was his. The process was almost laughable in its simplicity. No inspections, no long contracts, no negotiations, just a small payment and a confirmation email. He chuckled to himself, imagining the reaction of his friends back at the ranch when he told them he had bought a cabin for less than the cost of a candy bar. Most would have thought he was joking, and perhaps he was. But deep down, John knew there was something real about this impulse, something that stirred a sense of curiosity and anticipation he had not felt in years. A week later, John loaded his old pickup truck with some supplies, flashlight, rope, water, and a small toolkit, and headed out to the remote location. The drive was long, winding through dusty trails and over rocky hills. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, dry and quiet, with the occasional hawk circling high above. As he drove, John imagined what he might find. Would the cabin be nothing more than a ruin? Would it be filled with cobwebs and broken furniture? Or would there be something more? Something that the previous owners had left behind, hidden in the shadows of the tiny structure. When he finally arrived, the sight of the cabin made him pause. It was smaller than he had imagined, barely large enough to walk inside comfortably. The wood was aged to a dull gray, and the roof sagged in places as though it were holding on by sheer will. Wild shrubs and thorny plants surrounded the cabin, some growing through gaps in the wooden floor. It looked abandoned, forgotten, and yet strangely inviting. John stepped out of his truck and approached it slowly, each step crunching on dry earth and loose stones. The cabin door was stiff and reluctant, but with a push it creaked open, revealing a small, dim interior. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the light that filtered through broken windows. The smell was heavy with age, a mix of wood, earth, and something faintly sweet that he could not identify. At first glance, the cabin seemed empty. A small wooden table stood in one corner, and a chair lay toppled near the wall. Broken boards and faded curtains hinted at a life once lived, now long gone. John's eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, searching for anything unusual. As he moved further inside, he noticed marks on the walls, scratches, faint lines, and patterns etched into the wood. They were irregular, almost as if someone had been trying to communicate something long ago. John ran his fingers over them, feeling the grooves beneath his touch. Who had made these markings, and why? The questions raced through his mind, but there were no answers, only the quiet, heavy air of the abandoned cabin. It felt like stepping back in time, into a world that had been frozen and forgotten. He explored the cabin methodically, checking every corner, opening cupboards and peering under old furniture. Each step stirred up clouds of dust, which glimmered in the sunlight streaming through the broken windows. As he reached the back corner, he noticed a shadow that did not quite fit with the rest of the room. Curiosity prickled at him. He stepped closer, heart beating a little faster, and saw that the shadow was cast by a large covered object leaning against the wall. It was draped with an old tattered blanket, faded and frayed from years of neglect. John hesitated for a moment, feeling a mixture of excitement and unease. Something about this corner of the cabin felt different, almost alive. He reached out and pulled the blanket back slowly. What he saw made him step back, startled. There, hidden in the dim light, was a figure, strangely large, perfectly still, and hanging as if suspended in time. At first he thought it was a mannequin, perhaps a relic of some old display. But the shape, the proportions, and the details were unlike anything he had ever seen. The figure seemed to carry a presence and aura that was impossible to ignore. John's mind raced. Could this be some kind of artifact? A piece of forgotten history? He could not comprehend it yet, but he felt a deep sense of respect mixed with astonishment. He realized that the cabin, which had seemed so small and insignificant from the outside, held something extraordinary within. The discovery was overwhelming, and for a moment, John simply stood there staring, unsure of how to proceed. As he stepped back to catch his breath, he thought about the stories he had heard in the desert, about lost treasures and forgotten legends. Maybe, he considered, this was one of those stories brought to life, a secret hidden away for decades, waiting for someone curious enough to find it. He felt a strange connection to the cabin, as if the land itself had led him here, guiding him to uncover what had been hidden. John knew, even at that early stage, that his simple purchase of a 12-cent cabin had become something much more, something that would change the rhythm of his quiet life forever. Over the next hour, he carefully explored the rest of the cabin, taking notes and photographs, trying to make sense of what he had found. The figure remained a mystery, but he sensed that understanding it would require more than just casual observation. He would need to research, to learn about the history of the land, the people who had lived here, and the stories they left behind. The thrill of discovery mixed with a sense of responsibility. This was not just a curiosity. It was something precious, something to be treated with care and respect. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert floor, John stepped outside, taking one last look at the cabin. It was small, old, and weathered, but it held a story, a secret, and perhaps a piece of history that few would ever understand. He knew that he would return soon with tools, research, and a determination to uncover the truth of what lay inside. What had started as a simple, almost humorous purchase for 12 cents had opened a door to a mystery he could never have imagined. And so John Miller, the quiet rancher who had spent his life in the predictable rhythms of cattle and dust, found himself standing at the threshold of something extraordinary, a tiny cabin, a forgotten corner of the desert, and a discovery that would change everything. John returned to the cabin the next morning, the early sunlight casting a golden glow over the desert. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of sage and earth. His mind was still spinning from the previous day's discovery. He could not stop thinking about the figure hidden in the back corner of the cabin. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered, and it had filled him with both awe and a strange sense of responsibility. He felt a mix of curiosity and caution, knowing that he had stumbled upon something significant, something that deserved careful attention. As he approached the cabin, he noticed how different it looked in the bright morning light. The shadows that had seemed deep and mysterious yesterday were now replaced by a clarity that revealed the cabin's details. The warped boards of the walls, the small cracks in the roof, and the wild plants pushing through the gaps in the floor. The cabin looked abandoned and fragile, yet it had a quiet strength, standing resilient against the harsh desert elements. John took a deep breath and stepped forward, his heart beating a little faster in anticipation. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and he stepped inside, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. Dust swirled in the air, sparkling in the sunlight that poured through the broken windows. He could hear the faint sound of his own footsteps on the wooden floor, echoing in the stillness. For a moment, he simply stood there, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light, taking in the details of the cabin he now owned. Every corner seemed to hold a story, and he was determined to uncover it. John approached the back corner where the figure had been hidden. As he drew closer, he noticed small details he had not seen the day before. The blanket that had covered the figure was frayed and faded, showing signs of age. Dust had settled in layers, giving the impression that the cabin had been untouched for decades. He carefully lifted the blanket again, revealing the figure beneath. His breath caught in his throat. It was even more remarkable in the morning light. The figure had a presence that was almost tangible, as if it carried a history and a life of its own. He circled around it slowly, studying every detail. The figure's size was astonishing, far larger than a normal human. The features were delicate yet striking, and there was a stillness about it that made John feel as though he were in the presence of someone who had watched over the land for centuries. The cabin, small and unassuming from the outside, had become a doorway to a past that had long been hidden. John felt a mix of excitement and reverence. He realized that this discovery was not just a curiosity, it was a connection to something ancient and meaningful. Curiosity pushed him to explore further. John began to examine the rest of the cabin more closely. He noticed small items scattered around, fragments of pottery, old tools, and pieces of cloth. They were worn and faded, but each told a story of the people who had once inhabited or used the cabin. It was clear that the cabin had not always been abandoned. Long ago, it had been a place of life and activity. The more he explored, the more he felt connected to the history hidden within the walls. Every object, every scratch, every shadow seemed to whisper a part of the story, waiting for someone to listen. John took out his notebook and began making sketches and notes. He drew the markings on the walls, the shapes of the broken furniture, and the position of the figure. He wrote down questions that came to mind. Who had placed the figure here? Why was it left in this cabin? What was its significance? He knew that answering these questions would take research and patience, but he felt determined to find the truth. This was no ordinary discovery. It was something that required respect and careful handling. As he worked, John became aware of the quiet beauty of the cabin. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the walls, illuminating the dust in the air and creating patterns on the floor. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wood. It felt as though time had slowed within these walls, preserving the past in a way that was almost magical. John felt a sense of awe and humility. He realized that he was not just exploring a building. He was stepping into a space where history and memory had been carefully preserved. He decided to step outside for a moment, to breathe and take in the desert around the cabin. The landscape was vast and open, stretching endlessly in every direction. The mountains in the distance glowed with the early morning light, and the wind whispered through the shrubs and cacti. The desert was harsh and unforgiving, yet there was a beauty in its simplicity. John felt a sense of peace as he looked out over the land. This place had been waiting for him, holding its secrets quietly until he arrived. He felt fortunate to be the one to discover it. Returning to the cabin, John carefully moved some of the items on the floor to get a better look at the figure. He realized that the way it was positioned suggested intention. It was not placed carelessly. Someone had clearly taken the time to set it up, to protect it and perhaps to honor it. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He felt a responsibility to understand and respect the purpose behind this arrangement. This was more than a simple discovery. It was a connection to a culture and a past that demanded reverence. As he continued to examine the cabin, John noticed small details he had missed before. Tiny carvings in the wood, almost hidden in the shadows, depicted scenes of people, animals, and nature. They were intricate and delicate, showing skill and care. John realized that this cabin had been more than a shelter. It had been a place of meaning and significance. The more he learned, the more he understood that the figure was part of a larger story, a story that had been hidden for decades, waiting for someone to uncover it. He decided to photograph everything carefully. Using his camera, he captured the figure from different angles, the markings on the walls and the scattered items. He wanted a permanent record of his discovery, knowing that these images would help him research and understand the history of the cabin and the figure. Each photograph seemed to reveal new details, new clues about the past. John felt like a detective uncovering a long-forgotten secret, piecing together a puzzle that had been left untouched for generations. Hours passed as John worked, and by late afternoon the sunlight had shifted, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. He paused and looked at the figure once more. It seemed almost alive in the changing light, as if it carried the memory of those who had created and preserved it. John felt a sense of connection, as though he had been chosen to discover this secret, to be its caretaker and storyteller. He knew that this was only the beginning of a journey, one that would require patience, respect, and determination. Before leaving for the day, John made one final observation. The cabin, small and unassuming from the outside, was filled with layers of history, each waiting to be uncovered. The figure in the corner was a part of that history, a link to a past that had been carefully preserved and protected. John realized that his discovery was not just remarkable. It was a gift, a rare opportunity to witness something extraordinary. He felt humbled and inspired, knowing that his life had changed in ways he could not yet fully understand. As he stepped outside, the desert stretched out before him, silent and vast. The wind carried the faint scent of sage and earth, and the mountains glowed softly in the distance. John looked back at the cabin, knowing that he would return, that he would continue to explore and learn. What he had discovered was not just an old building or a hidden figure. It was a story, a connection to a past that had waited patiently for someone to uncover it. And John Miller, the quiet rancher, had been that someone. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. John felt a quiet excitement mixed with reverence. The cabin had revealed a secret, but it also held more mysteries, more truths waiting to be discovered. He knew that the days ahead would bring answers, but also more questions. This journey had just begun, and the tiny cabin that cost 12 cents had become a doorway to a world he could never have imagined. As night fell, John returned to his ranch, carrying with him the memory of the cabin and its secret. Sleep did not come easily that night. His mind replayed every detail, every shadow, every marking he had seen. The figure, the carvings, the objects scattered on the floor, all of it lingered in his thoughts. He realized that the cabin was not just a place. It was a story waiting to be told, and John knew that he had a role to play in that story, a responsibility to uncover the truth and share it with respect and care. The next morning, John felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness as he prepared to return to the cabin. He had spent the night thinking about the figure he had discovered, replaying every detail in his mind. Something about it was extraordinary, unlike anything he had ever encountered. He felt drawn back to it, compelled to learn more. He loaded his truck with supplies, camera, flashlight, notebook, and some basic tools, determined to take a closer look and begin understanding what he had stumbled upon. As he drove through the dusty desert trails, the landscape stretched endlessly before him, golden in the morning light. The mountains loomed in the distance, and the air carried the faint scent of sagebrush. The silence of the desert was comforting, broken only by the hum of his truck engine. John had driven these paths many times before, but today, the scenery felt different, almost charged with anticipation. He felt as though the land itself was aware of his journey, guiding him back to the cabin and the mystery that awaited inside. When he arrived, the cabin looked even smaller and more fragile than he remembered. The wind had shifted slightly, causing the old wooden boards to creak and groan. The wild plants around the cabin seemed to sway in rhythm with the desert breeze. John stepped out of his truck and approached the cabin slowly, his heartbeat quickening. There was a weight in the air, a quiet expectation that made him pause at the threshold. He pushed the door open, and the familiar creak echoed through the small space, greeting him like an old friend. Inside, the dust hung in the sunlight streaming through the broken windows. John moved carefully, mindful of every step. He headed straight to the back corner where the figure was located. Today, he was determined to examine it fully, to uncover details that he had missed before. As he lifted the tattered blanket again, he froze in amazement. The figure was even more astonishing than he remembered. The sunlight illuminated features he had not noticed before, the intricate details of the face, the proportion and size that seemed almost beyond human, and the presence that seemed to fill the room. John took a step closer, studying the figure with a sense of awe. It hung in a way that suggested care and intention. Someone had clearly placed it here with thought and purpose, perhaps to protect it or to honor it. The longer he looked, the more he felt a connection to it. There was a quiet dignity, an unspoken story that seemed to reach across time. John realized that this was no ordinary object. It was a link to the past, a part of a culture and a history that he could barely begin to understand. Determined to learn more, John began to examine the figure in detail. He used his flashlight to illuminate areas that the sunlight did not reach, noting the fine craftsmanship and unusual proportions. Every aspect seemed deliberate, from the positioning of the limbs to the expression on the face. He felt a shiver run down his spine, not of fear, but of recognition that he was witnessing something truly remarkable. It was as if the figure had been waiting for him, waiting for someone to uncover its secret and understand its meaning. As he worked, John noticed small items scattered near the figure, pieces of cloth, fragments of pottery, and worn tools. Each item seemed carefully placed, part of a larger arrangement he could not yet comprehend. He took out his notebook and began documenting everything. He sketched the figure, noted the positions of the items, and wrote down every observation. Each detail seemed important, a clue to understanding the story behind the cabin and the figure. John realized that patience and careful attention would be necessary to uncover the truth. Hours passed as he examined the cabin, and John began to notice patterns. The carvings on the walls, previously overlooked, formed a narrative. Scenes of people, animals, and nature were etched with care, telling a story of life and tradition. He traced the lines with his fingers, feeling the grooves beneath the surface. It was as if the walls themselves were trying to communicate something, a message from the past preserved in wood and dust. John felt a deep respect for whoever had created this space, for the thought and care that had gone into preserving it. He decided to carefully move the figure to a slightly better lit area of the cabin. He used cushions and blankets to support it, making sure not to damage any part of it. The figure, though still and silent, seemed almost aware of his movements, as if it recognized the care he was taking. John felt a strange sense of companionship, an unspoken understanding that this discovery was meant to be shared with someone who could appreciate it. He realized that the cabin and the figure were not merely artifacts. They were stories waiting to be told, lessons waiting to be learned. As John continued to explore, he discovered more markings on the walls, hidden in corners and behind old furniture. These carvings depicted scenes he had never seen before, rituals, celebrations, and symbols of protection. Each etching was precise, showing skill and care. John realized that the figure was part of a larger cultural and spiritual context, connected to the people who had once lived in this land. The discovery was overwhelming, but he felt a growing sense of purpose. He knew that this was a rare and precious find, one that required respect and careful attention. By late afternoon, John had gathered enough notes, sketches, and photographs to begin understanding the story the cabin held. He stepped outside for a moment, taking in the desert around him. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the leaves of the sparse shrubs and making the cabin creak in response. The mountains in the distance glowed softly in the setting sun. John felt a sense of awe and gratitude. This discovery was not only remarkable, it was life-changing. He knew that the cabin had given him a chance to witness history, to connect with a past that had been hidden for decades. Returning inside, John reflected on the importance of what he had found. The figure was not just a relic, it was a preserved piece of culture, a guardian of stories and traditions long forgotten. He realized that he had a responsibility to protect it, to learn from it, and to share its significance in a respectful way. The cabin, once a simple curiosity, had become a place of discovery, wonder, and reverence. Every detail, from the smallest carving to the careful placement of objects, carried meaning. As night approached, John lit a small lantern to continue his work. The warm glow illuminated the cabin, casting shadows that danced across the walls. He felt as if the cabin itself was alive, sharing its secrets slowly, piece by piece. He took careful notes, ensuring that every detail was recorded. The figure seemed to watch him silently, a reminder of the history and culture that had been preserved within these walls. John understood that this was only the beginning. There were more discoveries to be made, more stories to uncover, and he was determined to continue. Before leaving for the evening, John stood outside and looked back at the cabin. The desert stretched endlessly around him, silent and vast. He felt a connection to the land, to the history it held, and to the figure he had discovered. This cabin, purchased for 12 cents on a whim, had revealed a secret that few could have imagined. It had brought him face to face with the past, with a story that had waited patiently for decades. John felt honored to be part of it, and he knew that he had a responsibility to see the journey through. Driving back to his ranch, John's mind was full of questions. Who had created the figure and why? What stories did the carvings tell, and what traditions had been preserved here? How had this cabin remained hidden for so long, and what other secrets might it hold? He knew that finding answers would require patience, research, and careful investigation. But he also felt a deep sense of excitement. The cabin had given him a glimpse into something extraordinary, and he was determined to uncover the truth. That night, sleep was elusive. John lay in bed thinking about the cabin and the figure, replaying every moment in his mind. He could not shake the feeling that this discovery was larger than himself, that it carried lessons and stories meant to be understood and respected. He felt a growing sense of purpose, knowing that he had a role to play in uncovering and preserving the history he had found. The cabin, the figure, and the desert around it had become a part of his life, a mystery that he was now deeply connected to. By the following morning, John was ready to return to the cabin again. He felt a mixture of anticipation and determination. Each visit revealed more details, more clues, and more understanding. The figure in the corner was no longer just an object. It was a presence, a story, a link to a past that had waited decades to be discovered. John knew that the cabin had chosen him, that it had entrusted him with its secrets, and that his life had been forever changed by this remarkable discovery. John returned to the cabin with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. The memory of the figure in the back corner haunted him constantly. Every detail of the previous visits replayed in his mind. The carvings on the walls, the scattered fragments, and the quiet presence of the figure itself. He felt a growing sense that he was on the edge of a discovery that could change everything he thought he knew about the cabin and the land surrounding it. Today, he was determined to look closer, to uncover what had been hidden in plain sight for so many years. The desert air was cool and clear as John approached the cabin. The sunlight reflected off the distant mountains, casting a warm glow across the rugged terrain. The wind rustled through the shrubs and cacti, carrying the faint smell of sage and dry earth. John stepped out of his truck and felt a sense of calm mixed with excitement. He knew that whatever awaited him inside could be extraordinary, and he braced himself for the moment he would face the figure again. As he opened the cabin door, the familiar creak echoed through the still interior. Dust particles floated in the sunlight that streamed through the broken windows, illuminating the corners and casting long shadows across the wooden floor. John moved carefully, taking in every detail with the practiced eye of someone who had visited the cabin before, but knew that today would reveal something more. He approached the back corner with a steady hand, his heart beating faster with every step. When he reached the figure, John froze. The morning sunlight streamed through a window, falling directly on it and revealing details he had not noticed before. The figure was far more intricate and lifelike than he had imagined. The face, partially illuminated, revealed delicate features, with an expression of calm strength and quiet dignity. John felt a shiver run through him. There was something almost alive about the presence of the figure, as if it carried the memory and spirit of someone who had been forgotten by time, but preserved here for a reason. John stepped closer, his curiosity overcoming his initial hesitation. As he examined the figure more closely, he realized that its size was astonishing. It was much larger than a normal human, and the proportions were precise and deliberate. Every detail, from the hands to the posture, seemed intentional, conveying a sense of purpose and reverence. John felt a strange combination of awe and humility. He realized that the figure was more than just an artifact. It was a guardian of history, a symbol of a culture that had been carefully preserved and protected. Determined to understand more, John began examining the surroundings. He noticed that the floor beneath the figure had markings he had not seen before. Faint symbols etched into the wood suggested rituals or practices long forgotten. He traced the lines with his fingers, feeling the grooves and imagining the people who had made them. Each mark seemed to tell a story that had waited decades for someone to uncover it. John felt a growing sense of responsibility. This was not just a discovery, it was a duty to honor and understand what had been preserved. As he continued exploring, John discovered more items hidden around the figure. Small pieces of pottery, woven fabrics, and old tools were arranged in a careful pattern. The placement seemed intentional, as though someone had wanted these items to remain undisturbed, protecting the story they represented. John photographed everything meticulously, knowing that these images would be essential in understanding the significance of the cabin and its hidden figure. Each detail added depth to the story, revealing layers of culture, history, and care. Hours passed as John carefully documented the cabin. The sunlight shifted, casting long, moving shadows across the walls and floor. Each corner seemed to reveal something new, additional carvings, hidden symbols, and patterns he had not noticed before. John felt a deep connection to the space, as if it were speaking to him, guiding him toward understanding. The figure in the corner remained the focal point, a silent presence that seemed to demand respect and careful attention. He realized that this was more than a historical discovery. It was a cultural treasure, preserved through time, waiting for the right person to find it. By mid-afternoon, John decided to examine the figure itself more closely. He approached with care, gently brushing away dust and debris that had settled over the years. As he did, he noticed something extraordinary. There were subtle details in the construction that indicated skill and knowledge far beyond what he had expected. The way the figure was built, the attention to proportion, and the lifelike features suggested that it was created with purpose and deep understanding. John felt a sense of wonder. Whoever had made this had devoted time, effort, and care to preserve not just the figure, but a piece of history and culture. As he stood back to take it all in, John noticed the most astonishing detail yet. The figure, though still and silent, seemed to carry a presence that went beyond its size or craftsmanship. It was as if it held a memory, a spirit of protection and watchfulness. John felt a wave of realization wash over him. This was no ordinary artifact. It was a guardian, preserved to watch over something important. The thought made his heart race. He understood now that the cabin had been a sanctuary, a place where history and culture had been protected from the ravages of time. John spent the rest of the afternoon taking notes, drawing sketches and photographing every angle of the figure and the cabin. Each moment brought new discoveries, new details, and a deeper understanding of the story preserved within these walls. He felt as if he were peeling back layers of time, uncovering secrets that had been hidden for generations. The cabin, purchased for 12 cents, had revealed a world of wonder, mystery, and history that few would ever encounter. As the sun began to set, John stepped outside for a moment, letting the cool desert air wash over him. The mountains glowed in the fading light, and the wind whispered through the shrubs and cacti. He felt a sense of awe and humility. The figure in the cabin was more than a discovery. It was a responsibility. He knew that he could not simply take it or display it recklessly. It required understanding, respect, and protection. John realized that he had been entrusted with something extraordinary, something that demanded care and reverence. Returning inside, John took one last careful look at the figure. He realized that he had uncovered only a part of the story. There were more clues, more details, and more history hidden within the cabin. The carvings on the walls, the items scattered around, and the figure itself all pointed to a rich and complex past. John felt a renewed determination to continue his research, to seek out knowledge and understanding about the people and culture that had created this remarkable space. As night fell, John lit a small lantern, casting a warm glow across the cabin. The shadows danced on the walls, revealing details he had not noticed before. Each corner seemed to hold a secret, each shadow a story. He carefully recorded his observations, making sure to capture every detail for further study. The figure in the corner remained the focal point, a silent guardian of history. John felt a profound connection, understanding that he was now a part of this story, a witness to a past preserved through time. Before leaving for the night, John stepped outside once more, looking back at the cabin. The desert stretched endlessly around him, silent and vast. He felt a deep sense of respect for the history he had uncovered, and a quiet excitement for what he might discover next. The cabin, once a simple curiosity bought for 12 cents, had become a doorway to a world of mystery, culture, and history. John knew that the days ahead would bring answers, but also more questions. This journey had only just begun, and he was ready to follow wherever it led. Driving back to his ranch, John felt a mixture of awe, wonder, and responsibility. He thought about the figure, the carvings, and the carefully placed items in the cabin. He realized that he was not merely observing history, he was connected to it. The cabin had chosen him in a way to uncover its secrets and protect its story. Sleep did not come easily that night. John lay in bed thinking about the cabin and the figure, imagining the history that had been preserved and the lives that had once touched this place. He understood that this was not just a discovery. It was a calling, a responsibility, and a privilege all at once. By the following morning, John knew what he had to do. He would continue his careful exploration, document everything meticulously, and seek knowledge about the figure and the culture it represented. He felt a growing sense of purpose and determination. The cabin and the figure had revealed something extraordinary, something rare and precious, and John Miller, the quiet rancher, had been entrusted with uncovering it. The next morning, John felt a sense of purpose he had never experienced before. The cabin, which had seemed so small and insignificant when he first bought it for 12 cents, had become the center of a mystery he could not ignore. He packed his truck carefully, bringing supplies he thought he might need: camera, notebook, flashlight, and some gloves to handle delicate objects. He had decided that today he would explore every corner of the cabin, examine every marking and artifact, and try to understand the story of the figure in the back corner. Driving through the desert, John felt the familiar rhythm of the landscape, but today it seemed different. The mountains in the distance glowed with the morning sun, and the wind carried a whispering sound that made the desert feel alive. He imagined the people who had once walked these lands, their lives intertwined with the harsh beauty of the desert. He thought about the figure he had discovered and the careful preservation that had kept it intact for decades, maybe even centuries. A sense of responsibility settled over him. He knew that this was no ordinary discovery. It was a story that demanded respect and care. When he arrived at the cabin, John paused for a moment, taking in the structure. The weathered wood, the broken windows, and the overgrown shrubs all told a story of time passing, yet he felt that the cabin itself seemed to welcome him back. He pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside, the familiar smell of dust and old wood filling his lungs. The sunlight streamed through the windows, highlighting the details of the cabin he had begun to study so carefully. He made his way to the back corner where the figure hung, and felt a mix of awe and anticipation. The figure looked different in the morning light. Every detail, every line, every curve seemed more alive, more intentional. John felt that he was in the presence of something extraordinary, something that had been preserved not just as an object, but as a story, a guardian, a witness to the past. He stepped closer, examining the figure carefully. The size was remarkable and the craftsmanship meticulous. The expression on the face conveyed a sense of calm strength and dignity. John felt a deep respect for the person who had created it, for the culture that had preserved it, and for the story that had survived through the years. John began to explore the cabin in more detail than ever before. He examined the carvings on the walls, the symbols etched into the floor, and the scattered items around the figure. Each object seemed carefully placed, part of a larger arrangement he had only begun to understand. He photographed everything, made detailed notes, and sketched patterns he noticed in the carvings. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. This cabin had been more than a shelter. It had been a sanctuary, a place of protection and reverence, where someone had carefully preserved a piece of history and culture that they valued deeply. As he studied the carvings on the walls, John began to notice something remarkable. The symbols and patterns formed a narrative, a story of life, tradition, and guardianship. Scenes of people, animals, and natural elements depicted a way of life that had been intimately connected with the land. He realized that the figure was central to this story, a representation of a guardian who had been revered and protected by the people who once lived there. The cabin had served as a sanctuary for this guardian, preserving it and its story against the passage of time. Hours passed as John worked, piecing together the narrative from the carvings, artifacts, and the figure itself. He felt a growing sense of connection to the past, as if he were walking alongside the people who had lived and worked here centuries ago. The cabin had become more than a physical space. It was a repository of culture, history, and memory. John felt a deep sense of responsibility to honor what he had discovered, to protect it, and to understand it as fully as he could. In the late afternoon, John had a realization. He could no longer simply study the cabin from afar. This was a discovery that needed careful preservation and consultation with experts. He began making plans to contact historians, anthropologists, and members of local indigenous communities. He wanted to ensure that the figure and the artifacts were treated with the respect they deserved, that the story of the cabin and its guardian could be shared in a way that honored the past. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but John felt ready to embrace it. As he prepared to leave the cabin for the day, John paused to take one last look at the figure. The presence it carried was undeniable. He felt a quiet sense of awe, as if he had been allowed to witness something sacred. The cabin, once a small curiosity purchased for a trivial amount, had revealed a secret of immense cultural and historical significance. John realized that this discovery was a gift, one that required patience, respect, and care. He felt honored to have been the one to uncover it. Over the next few days, John worked to document everything thoroughly. He took thousands of photographs, made detailed sketches, and recorded notes on every carving and artifact. He studied the figure closely, noting the intricate details and the skill involved in its creation. He began to understand that this was a guardian figure, a symbolic protector preserved to honor the culture and history of the people who had lived on this land long before him. John felt a growing sense of purpose. He was not just uncovering history, he was connecting with it, ensuring that it would be remembered and respected. Eventually, John reached out to local historians and tribal representatives. He explained what he had discovered and sought their guidance on how best to preserve and honor the figure. Experts confirmed his suspicions. This was a rare and significant find, a guardian figure that had been carefully preserved as part of a sacred tradition. The cabin had been a sanctuary, a place of reverence and protection. John felt a mixture of pride and humility. He had stumbled upon something extraordinary, and now he had a role in ensuring that its story would be preserved and respected for generations to come. With guidance from the experts, John carefully prepared the figure and the artifacts for transportation to a cultural preservation center. He worked closely with the historians and tribal representatives to ensure that every step was handled with care. It was a meticulous process requiring patience and attention to detail, but John felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He was helping to preserve a story, a culture, and a history that had waited decades to be recognized. The cabin, the figure, and the artifacts had been entrusted to him, and he took that responsibility seriously. After the figure was safely relocated, John returned to the cabin one last time. The small structure seemed quieter now, as if it had fulfilled its purpose. He walked through the room slowly, taking in every detail, remembering the discoveries he had made and the stories he had uncovered. The cabin had been more than a place. It had been a doorway to the past, a bridge between generations. John felt a sense of closure, knowing that the history he had uncovered would now be preserved and honored, and that he had played a part in that process. Driving back to his ranch, John reflected on the journey he had taken. What had started as a simple, almost humorous purchase of a 12-cent cabin had transformed into an incredible discovery of history, culture, and human ingenuity. The figure, the carvings, and the artifacts had told a story that had waited patiently for someone to uncover it. John felt a deep sense of gratitude for the cabin, for the figure, and for the opportunity to connect with a past that had been carefully preserved. That night, as he sat on the porch of his ranch house, John watched the desert sky turn dark, the stars appearing one by one. He thought about the cabin, the figure, and the story he had uncovered. He realized that this experience had changed him. He had learned about patience, respect, and the importance of preserving history. He had witnessed something rare and precious, and he had been entrusted with its care. The journey had taught him that even the smallest investments, in this case, 12 cents, could reveal truths far greater than one could imagine. John knew that he would continue to tell the story of the cabin and the figure, sharing it in a way that honored the past and educated others. The discovery had not only revealed a piece of history, but had also connected him to something larger than himself, a culture, a story, and a legacy that would endure. The cabin, once a forgotten and insignificant structure, had become a symbol of discovery, reverence, and respect for history. John Miller had found more than a cabin for 12 cents. He had found a doorway to the past and a story that would be remembered for generations.